The janitor's cart squeaked as it rolled down the polished corridors of Fort Richardson. Most officers walked past without a second glance, seeing only another maintenance worker going about their routine. But Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb had a trained eye for details that others missed. As the woman in maintenance coveralls bent down to retrieve a dropped cleaning cloth, something small but unmistakable caught his attention. A faded unit patch barely visible beneath the collar of her worn uniform jacket. His steps slowed, then stopped entirely. That patch shouldn't exist on a janitor's uniform. In fact, very few people in the entire military had the right to wear it at all.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning shift at Fort Richardson began like any other Tuesday in October. The autumn air carried a crisp bite that reminded everyone winter was approaching fast in Alaska. Staff Sergeant Elena Martinez pushed her supply cart through the administrative building, methodically working her way through each floor. The wheels needed oil. They'd been squeaking for weeks now, but maintenance requests took forever to process, and she'd learned to work around minor inconveniences. Elena had been assigned to the janitorial division for 8 months now, ever since her medical discharge paperwork had been processed. The transition from active combat operations to mopping floors wasn't exactly what she'd envisioned for her military career, but life had a way of throwing curveballs when you least expected them. The doctors at Walter Reed had been clear about her limitations following the incident in Syria. Recurring migraines, occasional memory lapses, and chronic pain in her left shoulder meant she was no longer fit for field operations. The Army had offered her a medical retirement, but Elena wasn't ready to leave military life entirely. A desk job felt too confining, so when the facility's maintenance position opened up, she'd taken it without hesitation. The work was honest, straightforward, and gave her time to think. There was something therapeutic about the routine. Empty the trash bins, wipe down surfaces, vacuum the carpets, lock up, and move to the next room. No split-second decisions that could mean life or death. No radio chatter calling for immediate extraction. No improvised explosive devices hidden in roadside debris. Just the steady rhythm of ordinary tasks in a safe environment. Most of the personnel at Fort Richardson treated her with polite indifference. She was invisible in the way that maintenance staff often are, present but not really seen, essential but not acknowledged. Elena preferred it that way. The last thing she wanted was attention or recognition. Those days were behind her now. The third floor of the administrative building housed several important offices, including personnel management and strategic planning. Elena had clearance to clean these areas during off-hours when most of the classified materials were secured and the sensitive conversations had ended for the day. She developed her own system for working efficiently through the maze of cubicles and private offices, starting from the far end and working her way back toward the elevators. Colonel Patricia Hendrick's office was always particularly tidy, which made Elena's job easier. The colonel kept a clean desk policy and never left personal items scattered around. A few family photos, some military commendations on the wall, and stacks of paperwork that were always neatly organized. Elena respected officers who maintained discipline in their personal spaces. It spoke to character and attention to detail. As she dusted the bookshelf behind Colonel Hendrick's desk, Elena noticed a new addition to the collection of military manuals and leadership guides. A thick binder labeled Personnel Review Committee, Confidential, sat prominently on the top shelf. She carefully dusted around it, making sure not to disturb anything, but couldn't help noticing that several similar binders were arranged nearby. The Army was always conducting reviews and assessments, especially for personnel transitioning between roles or seeking promotions. The morning passed quietly until Elena reached the hallway outside the briefing rooms. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb was standing near the coffee station, reviewing some documents while balancing a steaming mug. Elena had seen him around the building before. He had a reputation as a fair but demanding officer who paid attention to details that others missed. His record was impressive: multiple deployments, several commendations for leadership under fire, and a reputation for taking care of his troops. Elena maneuvered her cart around him, offering a polite nod as she passed. Lieutenant Colonel Webb glanced up from his paperwork and returned the gesture with a brief smile. It was the kind of everyday interaction that happened dozens of times in military facilities across the world. Senior officers acknowledge junior enlisted personnel, both continue with their duties. But as Elena bent down to pick up a piece of paper that had fallen from her supplies, Lieutenant Colonel Webb's attention was drawn to something unexpected. The motion had caused her maintenance jacket to shift slightly, revealing just the edge of a unit patch that had been mostly hidden beneath her collar. The patch was faded and worn, as if it had seen considerable use, but the distinctive design was unmistakable to someone who knew what to look for. The 1st Special Forces Operational Detachment Delta patch wasn't something you saw every day. In fact, it wasn't something you were supposed to see at all. Members of the unit, commonly known as Delta Force, didn't typically advertise their affiliation, especially not on maintenance uniforms at remote Alaskan installations. The patch represented one of the most elite and secretive units in the entire United States military, composed of operators selected from the very best soldiers across all branches of service. Lieutenant Colonel Webb felt his pulse quicken as he processed what he had just observed. There had to be an explanation. Maybe it was a novelty patch purchased online, or perhaps a family member's keepsake that had somehow ended up on the wrong uniform. But the wear pattern
And fading suggested authentic use, and the way it was positioned, partially hidden but still technically within regulations, indicated someone who understood military protocol intimately. Elena finished collecting her supplies and continued down the hallway, unaware that her brief interaction had raised any questions. She had 3 more floors to complete before her shift ended, and she'd learned to maintain a steady pace to finish everything on time. The afternoon would bring different challenges, as more personnel would be moving through the building, requiring her to work around meetings and phone conferences. Lieutenant Colonel Webb remained at the coffee station longer than usual, his mind working through the implications of what he'd just seen. His experience in special operations had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about the woman with the maintenance cart didn't add up. Her posture, the way she moved, even her situational awareness as she navigated around him, there were subtle indicators that suggested military training beyond what would be expected for facilities maintenance personnel. The more he thought about it, the more convinced he became that Staff Sergeant Martinez deserved a closer look. Not because he suspected any wrongdoing, but because something about her story wasn't complete. In his experience, people didn't end up in dramatically different roles without significant reasons, and elite operators didn't typically transition to janitorial duties unless extraordinary circumstances were involved. As Elena's cart disappeared around the corner toward the next wing of offices, Lieutenant Colonel Webb made a mental note to do some discreet checking. Personnel records would tell part of the story, but he'd learned that the most important details were often found between the lines of official documentation. If Staff Sergeant Martinez had a background in special operations, there were protocols for ensuring she was receiving appropriate support and recognition for her service. The afternoon stretched ahead with its usual routine of meetings, briefings, and administrative tasks, but Lieutenant Colonel Webb found his attention returning repeatedly to the brief encounter in the hallway. Sometimes the most significant discoveries came from paying attention to small details that others overlooked entirely. The following morning, Lieutenant Colonel Webb arrived at his office earlier than usual. He'd spent the previous evening thinking about the maintenance worker and the patch he'd glimpsed, and curiosity had gotten the better of him. Military personnel files were confidential, but as a senior officer with appropriate clearance, he had legitimate reasons to review staffing assignments within his operational purview. Elena Martinez's file painted a picture that was both impressive and troubling. Born in El Paso, Texas, she'd enlisted at 18 straight out of high school. Her initial MOS was 11B Infantry, but within 2 years she'd volunteered for Airborne School, then Ranger Assessment and Selection Program. The progression was remarkable for someone so young. RASP had a notorious washout rate, and female candidates faced additional scrutiny in what remained a predominantly male environment. Webb scrolled through her training records, noting commendations for marksmanship, small unit tactics, and leadership under pressure. Her performance evaluations consistently rated her in the top percentile of her peer group. After completing Ranger School, another significant achievement, she'd been assigned to the 75th Ranger Regiment, 2nd Battalion.
The timeline showed 3 deployments to Afghanistan between 2019 and 2022, with gaps that weren't fully explained in the standard documentation. Webb recognized the pattern. Certain special operations assignments created holes in official records for security reasons. Her promotion to staff sergeant had come ahead of schedule, accompanied by several classified commendations that referenced exceptional performance in combat operations without providing specific details. Then came the medical entries. An incident report from March 2023 mentioned an explosive device encounter resulting in traumatic brain injury and multiple contusions. The follow-up medical evaluations at Walter Reed Army Medical Center painted a clearer picture: severe concussion, ongoing cognitive issues, and chronic pain that made her unfit for combat operations. The recommendation was medical retirement with full benefits, but Martinez had requested an alternative assignment instead. What struck Webb most was what wasn't in the file. No mention of Delta Force or any special operations detachment beyond the Rangers. Yet the patch he'd seen was unmistakably authentic, and Rangers didn't typically wear Delta insignia even as keepsakes. There had to be more to her story, assignments or training that weren't reflected in her standard personnel record. Meanwhile, Elena was dealing with challenges that didn't appear in any medical report. The headaches had been particularly bad this week, probably triggered by the changing weather pressure. She'd learned to work through them, but concentration became difficult when the pain spiked. Yesterday afternoon, she'd caught herself standing in Colonel Hendrick's office for several minutes, completely forgetting what task she'd been performing. These episodes were becoming more frequent despite the medications and therapy sessions. The neurologist at the base medical facility had explained that traumatic brain injuries could have lasting effects that weren't always predictable or consistent. Some days were better than others, but Elena never knew which kind of day she'd be facing when she woke up. The maintenance work helped in unexpected ways. The physical activity seemed to reduce the intensity of her headaches, and the routine provided structure that her injured brain found comforting. She developed coping strategies, writing detailed lists of daily tasks, setting phone alarms for important reminders, and keeping her workspace meticulously organized so nothing would be forgotten or misplaced.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story. Elena had just finished restocking supplies on the second floor when she encountered Captain Sarah Chen from the Intelligence Division. Captain Chen was relatively new to Fort Richardson, having transferred in from Fort Bragg 3 months earlier. She had a reputation for thoroughness and attention to detail that made her valuable for analytical work, but sometimes created friction with colleagues who preferred faster-paced decision-making. "Sergeant Martinez, right?" Captain Chen asked, pausing in the hallway with an armload of classified folders. "Yes, ma'am," Elena replied, automatically straightening to a more military bearing despite her civilian-style work clothes. "I've been meaning to introduce myself properly. I know we see each other around the building, but I don't think we've actually spoken." Captain Chen shifted the folders to free up one hand for a handshake. "How are you finding the work here?" Elena appreciated the courtesy, though she sensed there might be more to the conversation than simple pleasantness. Intelligence officers rarely made casual small talk without purpose. "It's good, ma'am. Steady work, and I like the structure of it." "That's excellent to hear. You know, I've been reviewing some staffing reports, and I noticed you have quite an impressive background before your current assignment." Captain Chen's tone remained conversational, but Elena detected the careful probing of someone trained in information gathering. "I served my time, ma'am. Did my job like everyone else." Elena kept her response neutral, neither confirming nor denying the implication behind the comment. Captain Chen nodded thoughtfully. "Well, if you ever find yourself interested in different opportunities within the intelligence field, I'd be happy to discuss some possibilities. We're always looking for people with real-world experience who understand operational requirements." The offer was intriguing, but Elena wasn't sure she was ready for anything that demanding. Her current role allowed her to manage her symptoms and limitations without putting others at risk. Intelligence work would require the kind of mental acuity and sustained concentration that her injury had compromised. "I appreciate that, ma'am. Right now, I'm focused on doing this job well, but I'll keep it in mind for the future." After Captain Chen continued down the hallway, Elena found herself wondering how much people actually knew about her background. She'd assumed that her transfer to maintenance duties would effectively make her invisible, just another soldier transitioning to support roles after medical issues. But if personnel were noticing her previous assignments, maybe invisibility wasn't as achievable as she'd hoped. The afternoon brought an unexpected complication. Elena was cleaning the conference room adjacent to Lieutenant Colonel Webb's office when she overheard part of a phone conversation through the partially open door. Military buildings weren't designed for privacy, and conversations often carried further than speakers intended. "I need you to run a more comprehensive background check," Webb was saying to someone. "Standard personnel files don't always tell the complete story, especially for people with specialized training backgrounds." Elena couldn't hear the response from the other end of the phone, but Webb's next comment made her stomach tighten with anxiety. "No, nothing official yet, just some inconsistencies that caught my attention. I want to make sure we're providing appropriate support for all our personnel, regardless of their current assignments." She finished cleaning the conference room as quietly as possible and moved her cart away from the area, but her mind was racing. If Lieutenant Colonel Webb was investigating her background, it wouldn't take long for him to discover the gaps and inconsistencies in her official record. Some of those gaps existed for good reasons: operational security requirements that protect both methods and personnel in classified missions. But other gaps reflected the complex reality of how special operations assignments actually worked. Not everything that happened in the field made it into official documentation, especially when missions involved cooperation with other agencies or foreign partners. Elena's experience with Delta Force had included exactly those kinds of operations where success depended on maintaining plausible deniability for everyone involved. As she loaded her supplies back onto the cart, Elena realized she was facing a decision she'd hoped to avoid. She could continue trying to maintain her low profile and hope that any investigation would respect the classified nature of her previous assignments. Or she could proactively address the situation by approaching Lieutenant Colonel Webb directly and providing whatever context she was authorized to share. Neither option felt particularly appealing, but Elena's military training had taught her that avoiding problems rarely made them disappear. Sometimes the best strategy was to engage directly and control the narrative before others drew their own conclusions from incomplete information. The question was whether she was ready to revisit parts of her past that she'd been trying to leave behind. Elena spent most of Thursday night staring at the ceiling of her base housing quarters, weighing her options. The small apartment felt cramped when her mind was racing like this: one bedroom, a kitchenette, and barely enough space for her few possessions. She'd grown accustomed to minimal living arrangements during her years in special operations, but back then the sparse conditions were temporary, between deployments or training rotations. Now this felt permanent, and the walls seemed to close in when anxiety took hold. By Friday morning, she'd made her decision. Rather than wait for Lieutenant Colonel Webb to complete whatever investigation he was conducting, she would request a private meeting and provide whatever information she could. It was a calculated risk, but Elena had learned that controlling the timing of difficult conversations usually produced better outcomes than being caught off guard. She submitted a formal request through the proper channels, citing discussion of career development opportunities as the meeting purpose. Military bureaucracy moved slowly under normal circumstances, but Elena was surprised when Webb's aide contacted her before lunch to schedule an appointment for 1600 hours that same day. Webb's office occupied a corner space on the 4th floor, with windows facing both the parade ground and the distant Chukotch Mountains. Elena had always found Alaska's natural beauty somewhat overwhelming, so different from the desert environments where she'd spent most of her combat deployments.
"Staff Sergeant Martinez, please have a seat." Webb gestured toward one of the chairs positioned in front of his desk. His manner was professionally courteous, but Elena detected the careful attention of someone trying to read between the lines of a conversation before it even began. "Thank you for making time to see me, sir." Elena settled into the chair, automatically maintaining military bearing despite her civilian work clothes. Some habits were too deeply ingrained to abandon completely. Webb studied her for a moment, then leaned back in his chair. I'll be honest with you, Sergeant. Your personnel file raises some interesting questions that standard documentation doesn't fully address. I'm hoping you can help me understand the complete picture. Elena had rehearsed this moment, but actually facing the conversation still made her pulse quicken. What specifically would you like to know, sir? Let's start with your training background. Your file shows progression through Airborne, RASP, and Ranger School, followed by multiple deployments with the 75th Regiment, all very impressive for someone your age. But there are gaps in the timeline that suggest additional assignments or training that aren't reflected in your standard record. The direct approach caught Elena slightly off guard. She'd expected more circuitous questioning, the kind of careful probing that allowed both parties to maintain plausible deniability. Webb was clearly someone who preferred straightforward communication. Some assignments don't appear in standard personnel files for operational security reasons, sir. I'm sure you understand the requirements involved with classified operations. Of course, but I'm also aware that personnel who've served in highly classified roles sometimes need additional support when they transition to different assignments. My concern is ensuring you're receiving appropriate recognition and assistance for your service record. Elena appreciated that Webb framed his inquiry in terms of support rather than suspicion, but she still needed to be careful about what information she could share. I've received appropriate medical care for my injuries, sir, and the transition to my current role has been handled through proper channels. Webb nodded, then opened a folder on his desk. I've been reviewing incident reports from your final deployment. An improvised explosive device encounter that resulted in traumatic brain injury and other complications. The medical evaluation recommends retirement with full benefits, but you opted for alternative assignment instead. Can you help me understand that decision? The question touched on something Elena had been struggling with herself. Why had she chosen to remain in the military in a diminished capacity rather than accept retirement and start fresh in civilian life? The honest answer was complicated, involving identity, purpose, and fear of losing the structure that had defined her adult life. The military has been my career since I was 18, sir. I wasn't ready to walk away from that completely, even though my role had to change. Elena paused, choosing her next words carefully. I thought I could still contribute in some capacity while I worked on recovering from my injuries. And has that approach been successful? Are you finding the work fulfilling, or do you feel like your skills and experience are being underutilized? The question was more perceptive than Elena had expected. Webb seemed genuinely interested in her perspective rather than just gathering information for some administrative purpose. It made her wonder if there was something specific he had in mind. What if I told you there might be opportunities to take on additional responsibilities while still accommodating your medical restrictions? Nothing that would compromise your health or recovery, but roles that would better utilize your background and experience. Elena felt a mix of interest and caution. What kind of opportunities, sir? Training and mentorship roles primarily. We have junior personnel who could benefit enormously from learning from someone with your operational experience. Additionally, there are consulting positions with various security assessments and protocol reviews that require practical field experience to be effective. The prospect was intriguing, but Elena had learned to be realistic about her limitations. The head injury has affected my memory and concentration in ways that can be unpredictable. Some days are better than others, but I can't always guarantee consistent performance. That's exactly the kind of self-awareness that makes you valuable, Webb replied. We're not talking about high-pressure situations with life-or-death consequences. These would be structured environments where you could work at your own pace and focus on knowledge transfer rather than operational execution. Elena found herself genuinely considering the possibility. The idea of sharing her experience with younger soldiers was appealing, and it would provide a sense of purpose that her current role sometimes lacked. But she also worried about raising expectations she might not be able to meet. Would this affect my current assignment? I don't want to create problems for the facilities management division if they're depending on me to maintain their schedules. Webb smiled slightly at the question. Your work ethic hasn't gone unnoticed, Sergeant, but I think we can arrange something that allows you to transition gradually while ensuring continuity in your current responsibilities. As they discussed the practical details of what such a transition might involve, Elena realized that Webb had approached the entire conversation with considerable preparation and forethought. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment idea triggered by curiosity about her background. He'd clearly been considering how to better utilize personnel resources, and her situation had presented an opportunity he'd been looking for. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, covering everything from scheduling flexibility to security clearance requirements for various training roles. By the end, Elena felt cautiously optimistic about the possibilities while remaining realistic about the challenges involved. As she prepared to leave, Webb offered one final observation that surprised her. "You know, Sergeant, one of the most difficult transitions for special operations personnel is learning to value different types of contribution. The skills and judgment you developed in high-stakes environments don't disappear just because the context changes. Sometimes the most important impact comes from sharing that knowledge with the next generation."
The village was too quiet. No children playing outside, no normal civilian activity, and the few people we saw avoided eye contact completely. Standard operating procedures said we should continue with the planned mission, since we hadn't received updated intelligence or specific threat warnings. But every experienced member of the patrol team was getting the same gut feeling that we were walking into something dangerous. Private Thompson interrupted with another question. "What did your patrol leader decide to do?" She called for a tactical pause while we reassessed the situation. Instead of proceeding directly to the planned meeting point, we established overwatch positions and spent 40 minutes observing the area more carefully. Elena paused to let the lesson sink in. It turned out there were insurgents positioned in 3 different buildings, waiting for us to follow our predictable route. We avoided a potential ambush because an experienced leader trusted the collective instincts of her team over the original mission parameters. Specialist David Kumar from the back row raised his hand. "But how do you develop those instincts if you haven't been in combat yet? How do we know when we're being paranoid versus appropriately cautious?" Elena appreciated the complexity of the question. These soldiers were trying to prepare for situations they'd never experienced, relying on training exercises that could simulate some aspects of combat but never fully replicate the psychological pressure and uncertainty of real operations. Instincts develop through consistent training and paying attention to details that seem insignificant at the time. Every field exercise is an opportunity to practice reading environments, assessing team dynamics, and making decisions under pressure. The more you expose yourself to challenging scenarios in training, the better your judgment becomes when stakes are higher. The conversation evolved naturally into a discussion of team communication, risk assessment, and adaptive leadership. Elena found herself drawing on experiences from multiple deployments, always careful to focus on decision-making processes rather than specific tactical details that might be classified or inappropriate for this audience. What surprised her most was how engaged she felt. The chronic headaches that had been plaguing her for months seemed less severe when she was focused on teaching. Her memory, which had been unreliable since the injury, felt sharper when she was accessing professional knowledge rather than trying to remember routine personal tasks. During the lunch break, Captain Chen approached Elena in the facility's small break room. "I've been hearing excellent feedback about your training sessions. The soldiers are really responding to your teaching style." "Thank you, ma'am. I wasn't sure how effective I'd be in a classroom setting, but it's been more rewarding than I expected." Elena poured coffee from the ancient machine in the corner, noting that someone had finally replaced the pot that had been cracked for weeks. "Have you given any more thought to the intelligence opportunities we discussed? I have a specific project in mind that might be perfect for someone with your background and current availability." Elena had been expecting this follow-up conversation. Captain Chen had mentioned the possibility of intelligence-related work several times, but always in vague terms that made it difficult to assess whether the opportunity was genuine or simply polite encouragement. "What kind of project are you thinking about, ma'am?" Chen glanced around the break room to ensure they were alone, then lowered her voice slightly. "We're conducting a comprehensive security assessment of all base facilities and protocols. It's partly routine evaluation, but also preparation for potential threat scenarios that require someone who understands how adversaries might approach reconnaissance and infiltration." The description immediately caught Elena's attention. Security assessments required the kind of tactical thinking she'd specialized in, but without the physical demands and high-stress environment that her current limitations made problematic. "What would my role involve specifically?"
Initially, reviewing existing security protocols and identifying potential vulnerabilities from an operational perspective. Later, if you're interested and cleared for it, participate in red team exercises where you help design scenarios to test our defensive procedures. Chen paused to let Elena consider the implications. The work would be part-time initially, allowing you to continue with your training responsibilities here. Elena felt a familiar excitement building, the same feeling she'd experienced years earlier when presented with challenging assignments that required creative problem-solving. But she also recognized the need for caution. Her injury had taught her to be realistic about her capabilities, rather than assuming she could handle anything that sounded interesting. I'd need to understand the time commitments and stress levels. My medical restrictions aren't just about physical limitations. Cognitive overload can trigger symptoms that affect my performance. Absolutely understood. We'd structure the work around your needs and availability. The goal is to utilize your expertise effectively, not to recreate the high-pressure environment that might aggravate your recovery. The afternoon training session focused on team dynamics and communication under pressure. Elena introduced several scenario-based exercises that required small groups to solve problems with incomplete information and conflicting priorities. Watching the soldiers work through these challenges reminded her of her own early training experiences, when everything seemed overwhelming until gradually becoming manageable through repetition and practice. Private Thompson approached her after class with a more personal question. "Sergeant, can I ask how you decided to pursue special operations training? I've been thinking about applying to some advanced schools, but I'm not sure if I'm ready for that level of challenge." Elena recognized the uncertainty in the young soldier's voice, the same doubts she'd felt before every major step in her career progression. Military advancement required constantly pushing beyond comfort zones, but it was impossible to know ahead of time whether you were truly ready for the next level of responsibility. The honest answer is that you're never completely ready for the next challenge. Readiness comes from doing the work, not from feeling confident beforehand. Elena gathered her training materials while considering how to offer useful guidance. What makes you think about advanced training? What's driving that interest? "I want to make a bigger impact, to be part of operations that really matter, but I'm also scared of failing and disappointing people who believe in me." Elena nodded, understanding the competing motivations that drive ambitious soldiers towards increasingly difficult goals. Fear of failure is normal, but it shouldn't be the primary factor in your decision-making. The better question is whether you're willing to commit fully to the training process, even when it becomes more difficult than you anticipate. As Elena walked back to her quarters that evening, she reflected on how much her perspective had shifted in just a few weeks. The combination of teaching and potential intelligence work was creating a sense of purpose she hadn't experienced since her injury. More importantly, she was beginning to see a path forward that honored both her past experience and her current reality. The Alaskan evening air was crisp with the promise of winter, and Elena found herself looking forward to tomorrow's challenges rather than simply enduring them. The security assessment project began on a gray November morning when Captain Chen escorted Elena through areas of Fort Richardson she'd never seen during her maintenance duties. The base command center occupied an underground facility that required special clearance to access, with multiple checkpoints and biometric scanners that reminded Elena of her previous assignments in more sensitive environments. The original security protocols were designed 15 years ago, Chen explained, as they walked through corridors lined with servers and communication equipment. Technology has advanced significantly since then, but more importantly, potential threat vectors have evolved in ways the original planners couldn't have anticipated. Elena studied the layout carefully, automatically noting sight lines, access points, and potential vulnerabilities that might not be obvious to someone without tactical training. The facility was impressive from a technological standpoint, but several design elements seemed to prioritize convenience over security, a common problem in installations that had grown organically over time. "What specific concerns are driving this assessment?" Elena asked, pausing to examine a ventilation grate that seemed unnecessarily large for its stated purpose. "Partly routine evaluation, but also some intelligence suggesting that adversaries are becoming more sophisticated in their reconnaissance methods. We need to think like attackers rather than defenders if we want to identify weaknesses before they become problems." The approach made perfect sense to Elena. Her experience with special operations had taught her that the most effective way to understand defensive vulnerabilities was to study them from an offensive perspective. Every security system has flaws. The key was finding them before hostile forces did. Major Robert Davidson joined them in the Central Command area, carrying a thick folder of architectural plans and security documentation. Elena had heard about Davidson but never worked with him directly. He had a reputation as a thorough officer who paid attention to details that others overlooked. "Sergeant Martinez, I understand you have extensive experience with reconnaissance and infiltration techniques," Davidson said, spreading several base diagrams across a conference table. "We're hoping you can help us think through scenarios that conventional security planning might miss." Elena studied the diagrams, noting how different areas of the base connected and where natural choke points or hidden approaches might exist. The exercise felt familiar, like puzzle-solving skills she'd developed years earlier but hadn't used since her injury. "Have you considered the possibility of insider threats?" Elena asked, pointing to several areas where authorized personnel could access sensitive facilities without additional screening. Someone with legitimate base access could potentially compromise multiple systems before anyone noticed suspicious activity. Major Davidson and Captain Chen exchanged glances that suggested this was exactly the kind of thinking they'd hoped Elena would provide. "That's one of our primary concerns," Davidson admitted, "but it's also one of the most difficult threats to plan for, since it requires balancing security with operational efficiency." Elena spent the next hour walking through various scenarios, each based on actual techniques she'd observed or employed in different contexts. The process was intellectually stimulating in ways she hadn't experienced since her injury, requiring the kind of creative problem-solving that had always been her strength. "What about social engineering approaches?" Elena suggested, studying the personnel flow patterns shown in the diagrams. Captain Chen looked up sharply from her notes. "Can you elaborate on how that might work practically?" Elena hesitated for a moment, realizing that her current maintenance role put her in exactly the position to understand these vulnerabilities firsthand. Maintenance workers have access to most base facilities during off-hours when security awareness is typically lower. Someone with basic knowledge of military protocols could potentially exploit that access if they had the right credentials and equipment. The conversation continued for most of the morning, covering everything from physical security to cyber vulnerabilities that might be exploited through unauthorized access to computer terminals. Elena found herself drawing on knowledge from multiple sources: her special operations training, observations from her maintenance work, and tactical thinking that seemed to come naturally despite her injury. During lunch, Major Davidson pulled Elena aside for a more private conversation. "I have to ask, your insights this morning were remarkably sophisticated. Captain Chen mentioned you have an impressive background, but I'm curious about the specific training that prepared you for this kind of analysis." Elena had been expecting this question eventually. Her contributions to the security assessment were revealing knowledge that went beyond what would be expected from someone with a standard infantry and ranger background. "I've had opportunities to observe security systems from different perspectives during various assignments, sir. Some of that experience isn't reflected in standard personnel files due to classification requirements." Davidson nodded thoughtfully. "I'm not asking for specific details about classified operations, but I am trying to understand whether we should be considering you for additional responsibilities that might better utilize your capabilities." The comment sparked Elena's curiosity. "What kind of additional responsibilities?" "There's a joint task force being formed to address security vulnerabilities across multiple installations in Alaska. They're looking for personnel with practical experience in threat assessment and unconventional thinking about defensive strategies." Davidson paused to gauge Elena's reaction. It would be temporary duty assignments, probably lasting several weeks at different locations, working with teams from various branches of service.
The prospect was both exciting and intimidating. Joint operations required adapting to different organizational cultures and working styles, which could be challenging under the best circumstances. With her current cognitive limitations, Elena wasn't sure she could handle the complexity and pressure of coordinating with multiple agencies. "What would my specific role involve in something like that?" "Primarily what you did this morning. Analyzing existing security protocols and identifying potential vulnerabilities that conventional approaches might miss. Some travel would be required, but nothing involving high-stress operational environments. Elena found herself genuinely considering the possibility, despite her concerns about her limitations. The work seemed to align perfectly with her interests and remaining capabilities, while offering the kind of professional challenge she'd been missing. "I'd need to be honest about my medical restrictions, sir. The head injury I sustained affects my memory and concentration in ways that can be unpredictable. I wouldn't want to accept responsibilities I might not be able to fulfill consistently." "That's exactly the kind of self-awareness that makes you valuable for this type of work," Davidson replied. "We're not looking for people who can work 80-hour weeks under extreme pressure. We need thoughtful analysis and creative problem-solving, which requires mental clarity rather than physical endurance." That afternoon, Elena continued her security assessment work, focusing on communication vulnerabilities and emergency response procedures. The more she studied the base's defensive systems, the more she appreciated both their sophistication and their limitations. Every security measure created new challenges for potential attackers, but also introduced new complexities for the people responsible for maintaining and operating those systems. Captain Chen observed Elena working through various scenarios, taking detailed notes about her methodology and conclusions. "You have a natural instinct for this type of analysis," Chen commented. "Have you ever considered pursuing formal training in security analysis or intelligence work?" "I've learned most of what I know through practical experience rather than formal coursework," Elena replied. "But I'd be interested in learning more about structured approaches to threat assessment. There are several professional development programs that might be perfect for someone with your background. Some are offered through military education channels, others through partnerships with civilian institutions." Chen pulled out her phone to reference something. "I can send you information about a few programs that accommodate flexible scheduling and medical considerations." As Elena wrapped up her work for the day, she realized that the past few weeks had fundamentally changed her perspective on what her military career might look like going forward. Instead of viewing her injury as the end of meaningful service, she was beginning to see it as a transition to different types of contribution that might be equally valuable. The November darkness was settling over Fort Richardson as Elena walked back to her quarters, but for the first time in months, she felt genuinely excited about the possibilities ahead. Her experience and judgment still had value, even if the context was different from what she'd originally planned. Maybe the most important lesson from her injury wasn't about limitations, but about adapting to new circumstances while maintaining the core elements of purpose and service that had always driven her career. 3 days before Thanksgiving, Elena received orders that would change everything. The Joint Task Force assignment had been approved, with her first temporary duty station scheduled for Elmendorf Air Force Base, only 20 miles from Fort Richardson, but representing a completely different military culture and set of operational challenges. The briefing packet arrived on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a courier who required Elena's signature and biometric confirmation before releasing the sealed envelope. Inside, she found travel orders, security clearance updates, and a preliminary assessment of Elmendorf's current vulnerabilities that made for sobering reading. Colonel Patricia Hendricks had requested a private meeting to discuss the assignment before Elena's departure. Hendricks' office felt different now that Elena was visiting as a security consultant rather than cleaning staff. The same space, but viewed from an entirely different perspective. "I want to be clear about something, Sergeant," Hendricks began, gesturing for Elena to take a seat across from her desk. "This assignment represents a significant opportunity, but it also puts you in a position where your judgment and recommendations will carry considerable weight. Are you confident you're ready for that level of responsibility?" Elena appreciated the directness of the question. Colonel Hendricks had a reputation for supporting her personnel, but also for ensuring they were prepared for the challenges they accepted. "I believe I can contribute effectively, ma'am, but I also want to be realistic about my current limitations. The head injury has affected some aspects of my cognitive function, particularly under stress or when dealing with complex multitasking situations." "That's exactly the kind of honest self-assessment I was hoping to hear," Hendricks replied. "The task force leadership is aware of your medical history and has structured your role accordingly. You won't be managing multiple simultaneous crises or making time-critical decisions under extreme pressure.
Your value lies in providing thoughtful analysis and identifying vulnerabilities that others might miss. Elena nodded, feeling cautiously optimistic about the assignment while remaining aware of potential challenges. What kind of timeline am I looking at for this work? Initial assessment at Elmendor should take approximately 2 weeks, followed by a brief return here for analysis and report preparation. After that, there are potential assignments at 2 other installations, but those depend on your performance and interest in continuing with the task force. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, covering everything from reporting procedures to emergency protocols. Elena left feeling both excited about the opportunity and aware of the significant responsibility she was accepting. That afternoon, she conducted her final training session with the junior enlisted soldiers before departing for Elmendor. The group had grown considerably since her first class. Word had spread about the practical, experience-based approach Elena brought to tactical instruction, and soldiers from other units had requested permission to attend.
Sergeant First Class Michael Torres raised his hand during the question period. Sergeant Martinez, what's the most important lesson you've learned about leadership under pressure? Elena had been asked variations of this question many times, but Torres's phrasing made her think about leadership differently. Her own recent experience had taught her that effective leadership sometimes meant acknowledging limitations and adapting strategies accordingly. The most important lesson is probably learning to distinguish between problems you can solve and problems you need help solving. Early in my career, I thought good leaders had to have all the answers immediately. Experience taught me that the best leaders know when to seek additional expertise or perspective. Private Thompson, who had become one of Elena's most engaged students, followed up with another question. How do you maintain confidence in your decisions when you're dealing with incomplete information? You develop confidence through consistent training and experience, but you also learn to remain flexible when new information becomes available. The goal isn't to make perfect decisions with incomplete data, it's to make the best decisions possible with the information you have while staying prepared to adapt as circumstances change. After the session ended, several soldiers approached Elena individually to thank her for the training and wish her success with her new assignment. The genuine appreciation in their comments reminded Elena of why she'd originally been drawn to military service: the opportunity to make a meaningful impact through dedication and shared commitment to excellence. Elena spent her final evening at Fort Richardson preparing for the Elmendorm assignment by reviewing technical manuals and security protocols. The Air Force approached base security differently than the Army, with greater emphasis on technological solutions and integrated systems management. Understanding those differences would be crucial for providing effective recommendations. Her phone rang around 2100 hours, Captain Chen calling with last-minute information about the Elmendorm assignment. "I wanted to give you a heads up about something that might come up during your assessment," Chen said. "There have been some unusual incidents at Elmendor over the past few months. Nothing dramatic, but pattern recognition suggests possible reconnaissance activity by unknown parties." Elena immediately shifted into analytical mode. What kind of incidents are we talking about? Mostly subtle things that might be dismissed individually but become significant when viewed collectively. Unauthorized personnel observed near restricted areas, communication equipment malfunctions that might not be accidental, and some gaps in security footage that could indicate tampering. The information added a new dimension to what Elena had assumed would be a routine security assessment. If there was genuine concern about active reconnaissance, her evaluation would need to focus on immediate vulnerabilities rather than theoretical improvements. Has this intelligence been shared with Elmendorm security personnel, or am I going in without them knowing about these concerns? They're aware there have been unusual incidents, but they don't have the complete picture that Joint Task Force Intelligence has assembled. Part of your job will be determining whether their current security measures are adequate to address the actual threat level they're facing. Elena spent most of the night thinking about the implications of Chen's information. Security assessments were complicated enough when dealing with theoretical threats and standard vulnerabilities. Adding the possibility of active hostile reconnaissance meant every recommendation would need to balance operational efficiency with genuine security concerns.
The next morning brought final preparations and administrative tasks before departing for Elmendorm. Elena packed her gear with the same methodical approach she'd learned years earlier, ensuring she had everything necessary for an assignment of uncertain duration and scope. Lieutenant Colonel Webb stopped by her temporary office space to offer final guidance before her departure. "I want you to know that this opportunity exists because you've demonstrated exceptional judgment and analytical ability over the past few weeks. Don't let uncertainty about your limitations overshadow confidence in your expertise." "Thank you, sir. I appreciate the faith you've shown in recommending me for this assignment. You've earned it through your performance, not through any special consideration. The task force specifically requested someone with your combination of tactical experience and analytical thinking." Webb paused, then added, "Also, remember that asking for support or clarification when you need it is a sign of professional competence, not weakness." As Elena loaded her gear into the military transport that would take her to Elmendorm, she reflected on how dramatically her situation had changed in just a few months. From maintenance duties that felt like marking time until medical retirement, she'd progressed to meaningful work that utilized her skills and experience in ways she hadn't thought possible. The vehicle pulled away from Fort Richardson as the late November sun cast long shadows across the Alaskan landscape. Elena watched the familiar buildings disappear behind them, feeling a mixture of anticipation and determination that reminded her of departing for her first deployment years earlier. This assignment might not involve the same physical risks as her previous operations, but the intellectual challenges and professional responsibilities felt equally significant. Her career had taken an unexpected turn, but perhaps that change represented opportunity rather than limitation. The road to Elmendorm stretched ahead, leading towards challenges she couldn't fully anticipate but felt prepared to meet with the skills and judgment she developed through years of military service. Whatever came next, Elena was ready to prove that adaptation and perseverance could transform apparent setbacks into new forms of meaningful contribution. Elmendorm Air Force Base sprawled across the landscape like a small city, with runways stretching toward the horizon and aircraft hangars that could house entire buildings. Elena's first impression was of organized complexity, everything precisely arranged but on a scale that dwarfed Fort Richardson's more compact layout. The Air Force clearly operated with different priorities and resources than she was accustomed to. Colonel James Mitchell, the base security chief, met Elena at the Visitor Processing Center with a mixture of professional courtesy and barely concealed skepticism. His handshake was firm but brief, and his questions during the drive to the security office suggested someone who wasn't entirely convinced that an Army sergeant could offer meaningful insights about Air Force security protocols. "We've been managing base security here for over 60 years without significant incidents," he commented as they passed rows of sophisticated aircraft worth hundreds of millions of dollars. "I'm curious what perspective you think you can provide that our existing personnel haven't already considered." Elena recognized the territorial response. It was natural for experienced officers to be protective of their operational areas when outsiders arrived with evaluation mandates. Encountered similar attitudes during joint operations in Afghanistan, where different service branches had to coordinate despite competing philosophies and procedures. "I'm not here to criticize existing protocols, sir," Elena replied carefully. "My role is to provide a fresh perspective on potential vulnerabilities, particularly from someone who studied infiltration and reconnaissance techniques extensively." Mitchell's expression softened slightly at the diplomatic response. "Fair enough. I suppose different viewpoints can be valuable, even when current systems are working effectively." The security briefing took place in a conference room lined with monitors displaying real-time feeds from cameras positioned throughout the base. Elena counted over 40 different video streams, creating a comprehensive surveillance network that would be impressive in any civilian security operation, much less a military installation. Major Lisa Rodriguez, the deputy security chief, walked Elena through the technical specifications of their integrated defense systems. Motion sensors, thermal imaging, acoustic detection, and biometric access controls created multiple layers of protection that should theoretically prevent unauthorized access to any sensitive areas. The system generates approximately 300 alerts per day,
Rodriguez explained, pointing to a computer display showing various alarm categories. Most are false positives, wildlife, weather conditions, equipment malfunctions, or authorized personnel triggering sensors in unexpected ways. Elena studied the alert patterns with growing interest. How do you distinguish between legitimate false alarms and potential security concerns when you're processing that volume of notifications? Experience and pattern recognition, mostly. Our security personnel develop instincts about which alerts deserve immediate investigation versus routine acknowledgement. Rodriguez paused, then added, although lately we've had some alerts that don't fit normal patterns, which is part of why this assessment was requested. Colonel Mitchell gestured toward a detailed map of the base layout. Why don't you start by walking the perimeter areas and getting familiar with our physical security measures? Tomorrow, we can review the technical systems and discuss any observations you have. Elena spent the rest of the day conducting a systematic survey of Elmendorf's defensive perimeter, paying particular attention to sightlines, natural concealment opportunities, and potential approach routes that might not be obvious from aerial photography or architectural plans. The base was enormous, with multiple entry points and hundreds of buildings that served different functions. What struck her immediately was how the base's size created both advantages and vulnerabilities. The extensive surveillance system provided excellent coverage of most areas, but the sheer scope of the facility made it impossible to monitor everything simultaneously with equal attention. An experienced infiltrator could potentially exploit the gaps between automated detection and human oversight. Near the northeastern perimeter, Elena discovered something that made her pause. A maintenance road that provided access to communication equipment was partially obscured by natural vegetation, creating a route that might not be immediately visible to patrols or camera systems. The area wasn't technically unsecured, but it represented the kind of overlooked vulnerability that could be exploited by someone with patience and planning. Elena photographed the location and made detailed notes about sightlines and potential countermeasures, then continued her survey. By late afternoon, she'd identified 6 similar areas where natural features or infrastructure design created minor security gaps that individually might be insignificant, but collectively could represent systematic weaknesses. That evening, Elena reviewed her notes while eating dinner at the base cafeteria. The food was better than she'd expected, and the atmosphere felt more relaxed than the typical Army dining facilities she was accustomed to. Air Force personnel seemed to approach military life with a slightly different mindset, equally professional but less formal in their interactions. Staff Sergeant Patricia Williams, an Air Force security specialist, joined Elena at her table uninvited but with obvious friendly intentions. "You're the Army consultant everyone's been talking about, right?" Williams asked, settling into the chair across from her with a tray of food that suggested someone who'd been working long hours. "Guilty as charged, Elena Martinez. And you are?" "Pat Williams, Base Security. I've been here for 4 years, so I know most of the quirks and problems with our current setup." Williams lowered her voice slightly. "Are you really here because of those weird incidents we've been having, or is this just routine evaluation?" Elena appreciated the direct approach, even though she couldn't share classified information about the assignment's specific motivations. "I'm here to conduct a comprehensive security assessment. What kind of weird incidents are you referring to?" Williams glanced around the cafeteria to ensure they weren't being overheard, then leaned forward conspiratorially. "Equipment malfunctions that don't follow normal patterns, security footage with gaps that might not be accidental, and a few times when perimeter sensors detected movement but patrols couldn't find any explanation." The description matched what Captain Chen had told Elena, but hearing it from someone with daily operational experience added credibility to the concerns. How often are these incidents occurring? "Maybe once or twice a week for the past 2 months. Individually, they're not dramatic enough to raise major alarms, but some of us have started wondering if there's a pattern that management isn't seeing." Elena made mental notes about Williams' observations while being careful not to reveal how closely they aligned with intelligence assessments. "Have you reported these concerns through official channels?" "A few times, but it's hard to file incident reports about vague suspicions and equipment problems that might have legitimate explanations. Security personnel who cry wolf too often lose credibility pretty quickly." After dinner, Elena returned to her temporary quarters, a small but comfortable room in the visiting personnel lodging facility. She spent the evening reviewing technical manuals about Elmendorf's security systems and cross-referencing them with her observations from the day's perimeter survey. The picture that emerged was of a sophisticated but potentially vulnerable installation. The base's security measures were impressive by conventional standards, but they'd been designed primarily to address direct assault or obvious infiltration attempts. A more subtle approach, involving patient reconnaissance and exploitation of minor systematic weaknesses, might succeed where dramatic tactics would certainly fail.
Elena's analysis was interrupted by a phone call from Lieutenant Colonel Webb back at Fort Richardson. "How's the assessment going?" Webb asked. "Any initial impressions you can share?" "It's a complex facility with generally good security, but there are some areas that deserve closer attention," Elena replied carefully, aware that phone conversations weren't necessarily secure. "I'll have more detailed observations after I complete the technical systems review tomorrow." "Understood. I'd also wanted to let you know that your work at Richardson has been noticed at higher levels. There may be additional opportunities for similar assignments if this one goes well." After ending the call, Elena realized that her temporary assignment had become something more significant, a potential career path that could provide meaningful work while accommodating her medical limitations. The prospect was both exciting and intimidating, representing possibilities she hadn't imagined just a few months earlier. The next morning brought a detailed review of Elmendorf's technical security systems with Major Rodriguez and the base's IT security team. Elena learned about network architecture, communication protocols, and integrated sensor management that represented millions of dollars in sophisticated equipment and software. But the most revealing part of the briefing came when Rodriguez mentioned almost casually that several system anomalies had occurred recently. Brief interruptions in data feeds, temporary communication glitches, and sensor recalibrations that might indicate someone was testing response procedures. "We've attributed most of these issues to routine technical problems," Rodriguez explained, "but given the timing and frequency, we thought they might be worth mentioning during your assessment." Elena felt pieces of a puzzle beginning to align. The physical vulnerabilities she'd identified, combined with technical anomalies and the equipment malfunctions Williams had described, suggested a pattern of reconnaissance activity that was more systematic than anyone had realized. "I'd like to spend this afternoon developing some scenarios based on what I've observed," Elena told Colonel Mitchell during their wrap-up meeting. "If my analysis is correct, you may be dealing with more than routine security challenges." 2 days later, Elena presented her findings to the base leadership team in a briefing that would validate everything Lieutenant Colonel Webb had believed about her analytical abilities. Her comprehensive assessment identified not just individual vulnerabilities, but a coordinated reconnaissance effort that had been testing Elmendorf's defenses systematically for months. The recommendations Elena provided weren't dramatic or expensive, mostly procedural changes and enhanced coordination between technical systems and human oversight. But they addressed the specific weaknesses that a patient adversary had been cataloging, potentially preventing a significant security breach. The week following Elena's briefing became a whirlwind of activity at Elmendorf. Colonel Mitchell, who had initially approached her assessment with polite skepticism, now treated her recommendations as urgent priorities. The security modifications Elena had suggested were implemented within 72 hours, requiring coordination between multiple departments and significant resource allocation. "Your analysis was dead on," Mitchell told Elena during an emergency security meeting 3 days after her presentation. "We've detected and interdicted 2 separate reconnaissance attempts since implementing your countermeasures. Without your assessment, those operations might have succeeded in gathering intelligence about our defensive capabilities." Elena felt a deep satisfaction at hearing the confirmation of her work's effectiveness, but also concern about the implications. If hostile actors had been conducting systematic reconnaissance of Elmendorf, similar operations might be targeting other installations across Alaska and beyond. Major Rodriguez approached Elena with additional information that validated her analytical approach. "The technical anomalies we'd been attributing to routine equipment problems correlate perfectly with the reconnaissance timeline you identified. Someone has been testing our response procedures for months, probably building a comprehensive profile of our security protocols." The discovery prompted an immediate expansion of Elena's assignment. Instead of returning to Fort Richardson as originally planned, she received orders to remain at Elmendorf for an additional 2 weeks, working with a joint task force team that would arrive from Pacific Command headquarters. Brigadier General Sandra Hayes arrived on a cold Thursday morning, accompanied by a team of specialists from various intelligence and security disciplines. Elena had never worked directly with general officers before, and she approached the first meeting with considerable nervousness about briefing someone at that level of authority. "Sergeant Martinez, your work here has attracted attention at the highest levels of Pacific Command," General Hayes began, settling into the conference room with the kind of presence that commanded immediate respect. "We need to understand whether the reconnaissance activity you've identified represents an isolated incident or part of a broader intelligence-gathering operation." Elena had prepped extensively for this conversation, organizing her findings into a comprehensive brief that addressed both immediate security concerns and larger strategic implications. "Based on the patterns I've observed, ma'am, this appears to be part of a systematic effort to assess multiple military installations, probably with the goal of identifying vulnerabilities that could be exploited during a broader conflict scenario." General Hayes leaned forward with obvious interest. "What makes you conclude that this goes beyond targeting Elmendorf specifically?" "The reconnaissance techniques being employed are too sophisticated and resource-intensive for a single target operation. The patience and methodical approach suggest long-term intelligence gathering rather than preparation for an immediate assault on this facility." Elena pulled up several charts showing activity timelines and technical analysis. Additionally, the specific vulnerabilities being targeted indicate someone with extensive knowledge of American military security protocols, suggesting state-level resources rather than independent hostile actors. The briefing continued for over an hour, with Elena fielding questions from specialists in electronic warfare, counterintelligence, and threat assessment. Her analysis held up under scrutiny, and several team members commented on the thoroughness and sophistication of her methodology. Colonel William Thompson, the senior counterintelligence officer on General Hayes' team, requested a private conversation with Elena after the formal briefing concluded.
"I've read your complete personnel file, including the classified portions that detail your Delta Force assignments," Thompson said once they were alone in a secure conference room. "Your analytical work here demonstrates exactly the kind of strategic thinking that made you valuable in special operations. Have you considered pursuing formal intelligence training to complement your field experience?" Elena was surprised by both the directness of the question and the implication that her classified background was more widely known than she realized. "I've been focused on adapting to my current medical limitations, sir. I'm not sure I could handle the demands of formal intelligence training at this point in my recovery." "That's where you might be underestimating yourself," Thompson replied. "Intelligence analysis requires exactly the kind of patient, methodical thinking you've demonstrated here. It's not about high-pressure decision-making under fire. It's about pattern recognition, strategic assessment, and connecting information from multiple sources to identify threats and opportunities." The conversation opened possibilities Elena hadn't seriously considered. Her experience with traumatic brain injury had made her focus on limitations rather than exploring how her remaining capabilities might be developed and utilized differently. "What kind of training opportunities are you thinking about?" "There are several programs designed specifically for personnel transitioning from operational roles to analytical positions. Some are offered through the Defense Intelligence Agency, others through partnerships with civilian institutions that specialize in strategic studies." Thompson handed her a folder containing program descriptions and application information. "Your combination of field experience and demonstrated analytical ability would make you an ideal candidate for several of these opportunities." That evening, Elena called Lieutenant Colonel Webb to update him on the expanded assignment and the conversation with Colonel Thompson. Webb's reaction was enthusiastic, but not entirely surprising. "I suspected your work at Elmendorf would open additional doors," Webb said. "The recommendations I've been receiving about your performance suggest that you found a career path that maximizes your strengths while working within your current limitations. It's been more rewarding than I expected, sir, but I'm still cautious about overcommitting to responsibilities I might not be able to handle consistently."
That self-awareness is exactly why you're succeeding, Webb replied. But don't let caution prevent you from pursuing opportunities that could provide long-term career satisfaction and meaningful contribution to national security. The following week brought intensive collaboration with the Joint Task Force team, as Elena's assessment methodology was applied to security evaluations at 3 other installations across Alaska. The pattern of systematic reconnaissance activity proved to be more extensive than anyone had initially suspected, involving coordinated intelligence gathering across multiple strategic locations. Elena found herself working directly with specialists from NSA, CIA, and Defense Intelligence Agency, providing a tactical perspective on how hostile actors might exploit the vulnerabilities they'd been documenting. The experience was intellectually demanding, but also deeply satisfying, combining her operational background with strategic analysis in ways that felt both challenging and achievable. Captain Jennifer Walsh, a DIA analyst, worked closely with Elena on developing countermeasures that could disrupt ongoing reconnaissance operations without alerting hostile actors to the fact that their activities had been detected. "Your insights about infiltration techniques have been invaluable," Walsh told Elena during one of their planning sessions. "Most of our analytical work is based on theoretical models and historical examples. Having someone who's actually employed these techniques provides a reality check that our assessments desperately needed." The collaboration led to the development of what became known as the Martinez Protocol, a comprehensive approach to identifying and countering subtle reconnaissance activities that combined technical monitoring with human analysis of behavioral patterns. The protocol was subsequently implemented at military installations across the Pacific Theater, providing a systematic method for detecting intelligence-gathering operations before they could compromise operational security. 3 weeks after her original assignment at Elmendorf was supposed to end, Elena received a phone call that would define the next phase of her military career. Colonel Thompson was calling with an offer that represented both validation of her recent work and opportunity for professional development she hadn't dared to imagine. "The Defense Intelligence Agency would like to offer you a position as a tactical intelligence analyst with specialized focus on threat assessment and security vulnerabilities," Thompson explained. The role would be based at DIA headquarters in Washington, but would involve temporary assignments to various installations where your expertise would be most valuable. Elena felt excitement and apprehension in equal measure. The opportunity represented everything she'd hoped for in terms of meaningful work that utilized her skills and experience. But it also meant leaving Alaska, relocating to an environment she'd never experienced, and accepting responsibilities that would test her capabilities in new ways. "What would the timeline look like for something like that?" Elena asked. "We'd want you to start with a 6-month trial assignment, allowing both sides to evaluate whether the position is a good fit. During that period, you'd receive formal training in analytical methods and intelligence procedures, while also contributing to ongoing security assessments based on your field experience." The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, covering everything from security clearance requirements to housing arrangements in the Washington area. By the end, Elena realized she was seriously considering a career transition that would have seemed impossible just a few months earlier. As she walked across Elmendorf's flight line that evening, watching aircraft operations that continued around the clock, Elena reflected on the unpredictable trajectory her life had taken. From maintaining floors at Fort Richardson to briefing general officers about strategic security threats, the transformation seemed almost surreal when she considered how recently she'd been struggling with basic cognitive tasks following her injury. But perhaps the most important realization was that her value as a military professional hadn't disappeared with her ability to serve in combat roles. Instead, her experience and judgment had found new applications that might prove equally important for national security, even if the context was completely different from her original expectations. The northern lights appeared as Elena reached her quarters, painting the Alaskan sky in brilliant green and blue patterns that reminded her why she'd grown to love this remote assignment. Whatever decision she made about the DIA opportunity, her time in Alaska had taught her that adaptation and perseverance could transform apparent limitations into unexpected strengths. Elena Martinez had discovered that the end of one story could become the beginning of another, and sometimes the most meaningful chapters were the ones you never saw coming. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.